Welcome, everybody. I see folks jumping in, and I am going to give everyone another moment to find that link and jump in. We are so excited to have you with us today. Get a little closer. All right, I will start my little speech because those of you who've been joining us for this whole series probably have it memorized by now. Welcome to Movement Tools 2022, a training series from the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, which is happening approximately every 3 weeks, usually on Thursdays, for the next few months. We're on Wednesday today because of the January 6th hearings tomorrow. We know that many of you would want to watch those. I'm Jessica Warris-Scruggs, the Director of Training and Capacity Building here at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Duwamish people in Seattle, Washington. I want to start off with a quick reminder. The PCAF is a 501c4 organization, but we know many of you are representing 501c3s and you're here in your official capacity. So we are going to dig deeply into immediate policy and strategy discussion, but we're not going to engage in electoral or partisan conversations during this session. So feel comfortable being here. One other piece of housekeeping, we've enabled the automatic closed captioning. If you go to the bottom of your screen and click on the live transcript, you should be able to enable the closed captioning. Because it is an AI, it is imperfect. We will clean it up and have a better version of captions for the video that we send out after the fact. Also, if you have joined and it says event participant, that means you did not register in advance, or at least you did not click the link that lets you register in advance. If you want to get the follow-up materials that will come out of this session, make sure you actually go in and register. Keegan just dropped the link in the chat, so make sure you do actually register so that we can get you the correct, get you all the follow-up materials, and you'll get the reminders for our next couple of sessions, which will focus on the Supreme Court and progressive messaging. So the goal of this training series is to dive into the policies and systems that shape our communities, identify the opportunities, the organizing strategies, the pitfalls, the downfalls, the lessons learned from our sort of toolkit of things that we can use to really land wins for our communities. And today we're going to dig into executive action, which is a vast terrain and one that's really important when Congress has ground to a halt. So I'm really excited to turn it over to my colleague, the incredible Kat Rowland. You may recognize her from past Movement Tools. And she has joined our team after nearly a decade on Capitol Hill, most recently as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Congressman Andy Levin, a Deputy Whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Prior to that, she was also a professional staff member for the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House and Senior Policy Advisor to the committee's ranking Democrat. I'm so excited to turn everything over to Kat today, and let's get started.
Thank you, Jess, and hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. We are coming together at a time when I think a lot of us are feeling helpless, and I want to acknowledge those feelings. We have been through and we are going through a lot. We are still grappling with COVID and its impacts. We're grieving for our neighbors, many of them children, murdered in Buffalo, in Uvalde, and in more than 200 other mass shootings that have taken place just this year. We're worrying about how we're going to feed our babies. We are wrestling with the reality that in a matter of days, the Supreme Court could strike down our right to abortion care, and with it, our right to access the healthcare we need to decide when or if we have children and how we shape our lives. These are enormous burdens emotionally, physically, and economically. And while we can take some comfort in knowing that we are shouldering them together, we can also stand together and say that we should not have to. We should not have to wait for relief. We should not have to see common sense solutions languish in Congress because outdated rules and corporate-backed politicians are willing to let us take all the pain so that their donors can take all the profit. We need to work together to dismantle the broken systems that have failed us. But we know that's going to take time, and we need relief right now. And that's why we're here today. to talk about executive actions that a president can take to tackle the problems we are facing right now. Executive actions come in different forms. There are executive orders that can direct agencies within the federal government to take certain actions, like one issued by President Obama that directed US Citizenship and Immigration Services to come up with a process that would defer the removal of undocumented people who came to the United States as children. This is the program we now know as DACA. There are presidential memoranda, which often involve the more routine functioning of federal agencies, like President Biden's memo directing federal agencies to put COVID-19 workplace safety measures in place for government employees. There are substantive proclamations that allow presidents to exercise their direct authority over things like federal land management, which is how President Biden restored protections for the Bears Ears National Monument and sacred site. These are just a few of the ways executive actions have allowed presidents to make monumental changes throughout our country's history. Some have made positive changes, like the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that enslaved people in the Confederacy were free. Other executive actions are a blight on our history, like the one that forced Japanese Americans on the West Coast from their homes and incarcerated them during World War II. Today, we're going to dig into positive changes that can be achieved through executive action now. We're going to talk about the different paths the administration can take, how much can realistically get done via those different paths, and how we can make sure these actions bring about real and lasting change for all of us. I'm so excited to turn to our incredible panel for today. And I want to start our conversation with Juliana. Juliana Macedo Nascimento is the Deputy Director of Federal Advocacy at United We Dream and United We Dream Action. Juliana is a DACA recipient herself who got involved in the immigrant rights movement through student and labor organizing in California 10 years ago and has been fighting for immigrant justice ever since. She's now based in DC and has been with United We Dream for the past 3 years. Juliana, thank you for joining us today. Next week, we're going to hit a really powerful milestone when DACA turns 10. The DACA program is maybe the best example of an executive action that was driven by movement organizing. It was and is an incredible victory, but it also demonstrates the limits of executive action. 10 years on from DACA, can you reflect on how we won this initial victory, what it's taken to protect it, and what we need next?
Sure. Thank you, Kat. And thank you, everyone, for being here and inviting me and UWG to participate in this conversation. And thank you to my fellow panelists who are here. I know Mary personally, she's great. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone else. But wanted to start by talking about, yes, those are big questions. So I'm going to try not to take too much time. But DACA really came from organizing immigrant youth that had been doing this work for over a decade, even before DACA was enacted, right? It came from the fight for the DREAM Act and the continued failure by Congress to pass any meaningful relief for the millions of undocumented people. And so if folks don't know, the DREAM Act was first introduced in 2001. So it's been that long, right? And folks have been fighting for it for a long time. It came up for a vote again in 2010, and that vote failed. And that really was an impetus for immigrant youth to put the pressure then on the executive branch and on then President Obama to really pass some kind of relief, some kind of protection for immigrant youth who had arrived in the country as minors, right? We have grown up here. This is the only place we've known. I myself am a DACA recipient, and putting the pressure on him really gave us a more targeted and narrow pathway to relief. We organized around him and his re-election. We did bird dogging, we did interruptions of his speeches. I'm sure y'all remember quote unquote dreamers standing up and interrupting him. And because of all of that organizing, we feel that we won Obama, like signing DACA. And as you mentioned, it's not an executive order. It was a memo by DHS telling USCIS just using their prosecutorial discretion, right, to make sure that folks weren't deported if they fit into certain criteria, and giving us an opportunity for a work permit. So it allows us to be able to provide for our families. So since then, over 800,000 people have benefited from the program, though an estimated 1.5 million people would qualify. But right now, only about a little over 600,000 people are currently enrolled in the program. And some of them were because they were able to adjust their status through marriage and other means. But for the most part, we've seen that since the last administration under Trump, where he tried to end the program, right, there's been a lot of uncertainty and folks have been very hesitant to apply. In 2017, Trump rescinded the program and we challenged it in court. We took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 2019, the Supreme Court heard our case, and the decision in 2020, to all of our surprise, was that the Supreme Court sided with us and kept the program alive. And that was a huge victory, also created by organizing, right? A lot of folks think that the Supreme Court and the executive branch might not be, influenced by public pressure and organizing, but creating the conditions for the Supreme Court to find it politically unviable to side against us was really critical in making sure that we got the majority there, even though it was already a conservative majority back then. We know that right now there is still another case making its way against DACA to the Supreme Court again. Texas and 6 other states have challenged the program on its merits. And by that, I mean, the last case, we challenged the last administration on how they ended the program, right? So over administrative law. And now these states are challenging the program itself on the lawfulness of the program. And so this case is about to go to the 5th Circuit. We have a hearing on July 6th, and we know that 5th Circuit is anti-immigrant. So we expect this case to make its way back to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, it's even more conservative this time, right? So we expect the appeal for next year. So as beneficial as DACA has been, and I can attest to that personally, it has never been enough, right? It doesn't confer us any kind of legal status. I have no right to leave the country unless I apply with the government for 3 very narrow requirements. There's no path to adjustment just through the policy. And it's outdated at this point and exclusionary. There's a report by our partners at Forward that just came out saying that of the 100,000 high schoolers who are expected to graduate this year who are undocumented, only about a vast majority of them don't even qualify for DACA anymore because of date cutoffs and age limits, right? You have to have been here in 2007 and you have to have proof that you were here in 2012 and all of that. So at the end of the day, really what we need is Congress to act, right? Like, it's good that we have this executive action in place, but permanent protections can only come from Congress. And so we really need them to have a pathway to citizenship for all immigrant youth. So I'm gonna stop here. But I hope I went through a bit of the history and the folks are more familiar with the program now.
Thank you. That was a fantastic overview and remarkably concise. So really appreciate that. We're going to turn now to one of the topics that's been most in the news around presidential action, and that's student debt. Mike Pierce is executive director and co-founder of the Student Borrower Protection Center, or SBPC. He is an attorney, advocate, and former senior regulator who joined SBPC after more than a decade fighting for student loan borrowers' rights on Capitol Hill and at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. For the past 3 years, Mike served as the founding policy director and managing counsel at SBPC. Mike, there are reports that the president plans to cancel $10,000 of student debt for borrowers earning under $150,000 or $300,000 for married couples. Can you tell us, what do you think of those reports?
I think we find ourselves in this very interesting place where after a decade of action by individual borrowers who really brought this idea into the mainstream, that the president can cancel student debt, that this legal authority sits with the executive, that it doesn't require Congress, and that it's a good thing to do. We find ourselves in this place where Joe Biden is thinking about taking what would have been an unimaginable action in the Obama administration, but also something that's really too small to be able to make the kind of life-changing difference for most people with student debt. So roughly a third of all people that have student loans owe $10,000 or fewer. And for those people, depending on the means testing, depending on the administrative burden, and I know we'll get to kind of those issues down the line, this will be enormously consequential. It is probably the biggest single thing that the president can do for millions of people's finances with a stroke of a pen that he hasn't already done yet. For everybody else, though, another 15% of people with student debt, several million people have about $20,000 in debt or less. But the kind of the back half of student loan borrowers owe lots and lots of debt. And we've seen Senator Warren, Senator Schumer, Senator Sanders, Senator Warnock, Congresswoman Presley, and Waters and Alma Adams and Omar in the House push for much bigger action by the president, whether that's the $50,000 number that Senator Schumer and Senator Warren have been pushing for, or whether that's canceling all debt, which is what Senator Sanders and Congresswoman Omar and others have pushed for. There's this effort to try to get the president to kind of push up on his level of ambition. And at the same time, I think all of us that do work that's facing government worry about administrative burden. And that the president's desire to means test is to be able to have a talking point that says we won't be doing anything for those rich doctors and lawyers is actually going to have the perverse effect of foreclosing debt relief for millions, maybe more, low-income borrowers that have failed to navigate the really awful and complicated existing student loan safety net. A lot of the work that we do is focused on that safety net, the failings of income-driven repayment, disability discharge, and other programs to be able to protect the people that they're supposed to protect. And I think everyone that does student loan organizing and advocacy, and certainly our organization is part of a very large coalition doing this work, have learned this lesson the hard way already. The law promises a lot of things to people, and it doesn't deliver most of the time. And so the president has a chance to go big, both in terms of the dollar number and also really finally recognizing that when people have to jump through hoops, the people you want to serve aren't going to benefit. And that means tested debt cancellation is actually going to have an outcome that's regressive, even if on paper it looks progressive.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I'm sure we will turn back to this topic later today when we get into more discussion. But next, I want to turn to Danny. Danny Hooper is Evergreen Action's climate advocate and handles congressional and administrative outreach. Before Evergreen, she worked on the Hill for over 3 years, where she covered energy and climate for a New York member on the House Ways and Means Committee. Danny is also a climate activist, former Clean Energy Leadership Institute fellow, and former fossil fuel divestment organizer. Danny, President Biden started his presidency with a flurry of executive orders. Since then, how do you rate the administration's progress on climate? And specifically, what are the areas in which you think President Biden has made the most progress? And what are the areas where we really need more action on this topic?
Great. Thanks, Kat. Thanks for having me. Thanks for putting this webinar together. Really appreciate it. I wanted to start by saying that at Evergreen, we are still pushing for the $555 billion in reconciliation investments as passed in the House passed bill. This is really the single most important step that the federal government can take to act on climate. And multiple analyses have shown us that that we need bold legislative action, and then there's a gap that we need to fill with robust executive action in order for us to deliver on the president's climate commitments. So I just wanted to say that one of the things that we talk about a lot at Evergreen is walking and chewing gum at the same time. So while we keep up that pressure on the administration to get put together a reconciliation deal. We also need to be putting pressure on the administration at the same time to move on climate action. So to get to your question about where the administration has acted and where they haven't, this has been a big question that we talk about here at Evergreen, and we have a lot of reports that ask that question, and I can drop them in the chat at in a second. But the upshot is that the administration has made some serious progress in their first year and a half, but they really need to ramp up their climate executive action in order to meet their own commitments that they've made, and also the commitments, the targets that the science demands. As you mentioned, there has been some notable successes that they've made pretty early on. The one that I think about is their announcement to do a whole of government approach, which means that the administration has to tackle climate change across many agencies, and they did that through a series of executive orders, one of which was the Federal Sustainability Executive Order that made it so that federal agencies could lead by example and use their own purchasing power to lead and spur clean energy investment. And they also announced that they were going to slash emissions by 50% by 2030, and they announced that they were going to try to get to 100% clean electricity by 2035. And those were really important, critical announcements. But on the other hand, there have been some delays and some disappointments. Most notably, they promised to end all new oil and gas leasing sales on public lands and waters. And thus far, our rate of federal fossil fuel production remains pretty high. One of the things that Evergreen is doing is pushing Biden's Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, BOEM, to release a 5-year offshore plan that has no new leasing, and that's coming up later this month. And this is a really tough subject, really sticky, really nuanced. We have a paper coming out later this month on public lands, oil and gas leasing, that we can make sure gets to everybody. So keep an eye out for that. Another thing I wanted to mention is that you may know this, but about a quarter of all of our domestic US emissions comes from the electricity sector. So Evergreen has launched a 100% clean power campaign that's aimed at making sure that the administration is using their executive authority to deliver on their promise to get to 100% clean electricity by 2035. And that's by 3 key pillars, one of which is making sure that the EPA is launching a multi-pollutant comprehensive approach to tackling pollution in the power sector and tackling the range of dangers that power plants pose. Making sure that FERC is imposing different market and transmission improvements to make sure that clean energy can get easily deployed. And then lastly, making sure that DOE and other agencies are enhancing state leadership by using federal dollars. And I could drop some resources in the chat in just a second, but those are some of the 3 main steps that we think the administration can do to deliver on their clean energy commitments, and they're absolutely achievable. And as advocates, we need to sort of hold their feet to the fire and make sure that they deliver.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Danny. And last but certainly not least, I want to turn to Mary Small. As Indivisible's National Advocacy Director, Mary leads advocacy strategy across the organization's core issue areas, including democracy, economic justice, immigration, climate, and healthcare. Prior to her work at Indivisible, Mary was the policy director at Detention Watch Network and co-led the Defund Hate campaign to defund the anti-immigrant enforcement machine. Before joining Indivisible, Mary spent over a decade working in the overlap between migrant rights, racial justice, anti-criminalization, and human rights, and is thrilled to now be applying those lessons to the intersectional advocacy work Indivisible prioritizes. Mary, we've heard about a few different areas now where President Biden could take action, and Indivisible has been calling on the Biden administration to use every tool at their disposal to deliver for our communities. Can you talk about the strategy and trade-offs for our movement in pushing for executive action? What can we gain, and what's the risk in focusing on executive actions in particular?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kat. And Mike and Juliana and Danny and Kat, it's really great to be here with all of you and to everyone who's joining the webinar. So this is great, and I'm looking forward to our conversation in the back half of this. So there's a lot of really gnarly strategy questions tied to executive action from my perspective. I'll just say as a disclaimer, I generally believe to be true about progressive advocacy work that there's no single silver bullet. We actually need a complex ecosystem of different folks playing different roles and doing them excellently and in communication with each other in order to sort of maximize our potential impact. So that's my disclaimer. Like, I don't think that there's a single right answer. I think that there's multiple good roles that have to be in communication with one another. When it comes to executive action, my observation is that there's usually like a few different things that people are trying to do with it. What's tricky is that they sometimes can be at cross purposes with one another. And that's why the communication across roles is so important. So sometimes people are using executive action to try to push legislation. Like, the end goal isn't just the executive action, it's permanent action by Congress to deliver on the outcome. Sometimes people are trying to use executive action to shift the Overton window, to move the window of what is politically possible, or like the center of gravity inside of a political party, and build consensus around a new idea. And action by the president or by the administration is a way to begin cementing consensus around a different idea. So that's moving the Overton window. Sometimes people are trying to accomplish harm mitigation. It's like not the whole thing we want, but we're trying to create backstops to stop more harm to more people. And sometimes we're just trying to win the maximum amount that we can with an executive action, but knowing it's not the whole thing. So I just named 4 different purposes for executive action: shifting the Overton window, pushing legislation, harm mitigation, and winning what's possible. You can accomplish more than one of those at a time, but it's real hard to accomplish all 4. And we need people who are doing all of those across the different areas that we work on. And so I think that that's where we get into some of the like tricky choices about how we build out executive action strategy that delivers, is healthy for the movement, and sort of holds the different roles that so many of us have. So that's like a little bit of my frame. I will just say that as one example for Indivisible, the way that we have oriented towards executive action this Congress, I'm not saying that this is the right answer. I'm saying that it's one role and it's been the one that we've landed on, but I can kind of walk through the way that we've thought about it if it's helpful. It's twofold. So one, because we know that legislation is more enduring than executive action. We've seen efforts to roll back executive actions and also just the limits of executive power. We focused on legislation first. So last year, in the beginning part of this Congress, we were fully focused on legislation. To go to what Danny said earlier, we've always needed a complementary approach. And especially when we were looking at reconciliation, an earlier training talked about the fact that like reconciliation is a process that was built for austerity that progressives tried to hijack for progressive purposes. That's amazing. We should definitely hijack bad processes for good outcomes, but it leaves some gaps. And so a bill passed by reconciliation was always going to need to be married with executive action. So we're always going to need both, but we chose to focus on the legislative pushes first to see what progress we could make there. And it's only actually when we saw Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema's unwillingness to eliminate the filibuster, to move on a partisan basis, the stalling of Build Back Better, at least for a time period, that we shifted towards a focus on executive action to see what we could pick up there. That's one way that we thought about it. And then in terms of the level of ambition, our somewhat crude shorthand that we use to talk about our level of ambition of what we're pursuing is to sit our butts on the left windowsill of the Overton window and lock in what is possible to lock in. Democrats have a governing trifecta. Joe Biden is in the White House right now. We should use this window of political possibility to lock into either law or executive action what we can right now. And some folks are still using executive action to move the Overton window. That is good too. But I think being clear about what your campaign is trying to do. Are you trying to move the Overton window? Are you sitting your butt on the left windowsill of the Overton window and trying to lock stuff in? Are you trying to do something different? Is really helpful. And having conversations across the different roles. My observation is really key to avoiding some kind of progressive movement bumper cars and allowing us to pick up all of the possible impact that we can.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great overview. And we're going to dig into some of those thornier questions as we get into our discussion today. So now I want to open up the conversation to all of our panelists. I'm going to throw a few questions out there, give folks an opportunity to respond. If we're really loving part of the conversation, we'll keep it going. And eventually we will move on to audience Q&A, because I want to make sure that the folks watching at home are also getting their questions answered and not just me. But let me get started by asking this. We tend to think of executive action sometimes as getting something done with just the stroke of a pen. But all of you know that it takes a lot more than that, both to win executive action and to make sure that it's implemented in a way that people can really feel. So how do we as a progressive movement plan and sustain campaigns around executive action? Another way of putting that, I guess, what do we need to be doing to both spark action and then ensure that what happens on paper gets felt by our families? And I'll let anybody who wants to start us off respond.
I can jump in to kick it off. I think that one of the critiques that I would make of, myself included, like all of us, is that we're often insufficiently attentive to implementation. And at times we've left impact on the table because of that. So, right, like anyone who's a campaigner knows, you like push for your demand, you win your demand, and then you pivot. But we get to make choices about what the pivot is. And a lot of the time, our pivot is to our next demand. And that's good. It's how you keep building momentum and shifting towards the society, the just and equitable society that we all want. And if we don't have some portion of folks who are staying focused on implementing the thing that we actually won, we risk two things. One thing that we risk is it not being implemented. And then the other thing that we risk is it being implemented, but then taken away. And so I think when I talk about like a sophisticated ecosystem of different roles, that's part of what I'm talking about, because you don't want 100% of your people to pivot into implementation, because then you're not using the momentum to demand more. But you also don't want 100% of your people to demand the next demand without having anyone come behind on implementation. I'm like, sorry, Juliana, I'm going to do this to you because I know you, but to put you on the spot, like I think DACA is a good example here, right? Like folks ran DACA clinics forever to help people through this burdensome process of applying for and then renewing DACA. This speaks to what Mike was saying about the administrative burden and how exclusionary that can be, right? So that part of that is like the implementation piece. Juliana, maybe you can speak to some of how United We Dream and a lot of other organizations were holding both, supporting people through implementation while also continuing to fight for more. I think that's a great example that we've already seen play out over a decade, and that Mike forecasted in talking about student debt relief.
Yeah, since you did put me on the spot, yes, I think that that was also the example that was coming to my mind, right? Because like we are still holding DACA clinics because even now, right, because of all the confusion that I've mentioned before with the Trump administration rescinding the program and all the court challenges, a lot of people don't even know that they can still apply for renewals, right? Initial applications are not being accepted right now, unfortunately, but renewals still are. I just renewed mine. And so that is something that we have to be constantly educating our folks about, right? Like about all the updates that are happening with the policy and that they can still go on and keep renewing. And so we keep running these DACA clinics as if like it's brand new, but it's been 10 years.
Yeah, Mike, sorry to cut you off. You might be wanting to jump in there, but on the implementation piece, working with state and local governments and tribal communities is obviously enormously important. We got to make sure that we're pushing the administration to deploy those investments, whether they're from the IIJA, whether they're from reconciliation, whether they're from executive action, to the places in which there is already existing progress, existing climate progress, or any kind of progress at the subnational level. And in the case of climate, the administration has made a little bit of headway on that already. They appointed an infrastructure coordinator who has a mandate to work with states in the implementation of the federal investments. But there's a lot we can do to keep pushing them to keep working at the subnational level and keep making those partnerships, those federal state partnerships and place-based strategies stronger.
And I wanted to flag, I obviously agree with all of that. And I think that in particular, the state and local government partnership opportunities are really important because you have people that are not going to be necessarily able to be at the forefront of your movement as you're movement building around your issues, but are in change-making roles as policymakers and can be impactful in implementation in a way that where they have to be silent on policy change. But I did want to also flag that I think some of the kind of big membership organizations that are in our coalition are often maybe the most helpful in like delivering on implementation too. So we and like help us set up as movement builders, help us set up the next win too. So on student debt, we a bit, not quite a year ago, but a year in October, President Biden announced some really big changes to the public service loan forgiveness program. And for anybody that's had the misfortune of encountering this mess, it is very, very poorly run and has been scandal plagued for basically its entire life. And the large labor unions that represent millions of public sector workers really led the charge here to get the Biden administration to take a pretty big executive action to set up some student debt cancellation for some public service workers, which is not the same thing as canceling student debt for everybody. But they have also stayed at the table to help connect their members, workers with student debt, with this kind of smaller debt cancellation program. Tomorrow morning, we're going to be announcing a partnership with AFT, NEA, the Teamsters, and AFSCME to connect working people that work in public service with their right to debt cancellation under public service loan forgiveness. But also, with much more fanfare, a week and a half ago, we led a coalition letter that included the largest labor table that's ever been put together on student debt. And the way that we got there was by helping educate the leadership of a lot of unions about the importance of these targeted programs. And then suddenly union leaders hear directly from workers that are struggling to navigate this mess. And it becomes much more self-evident that you need to do something bigger. And that if Joe Biden is actually going to fix this mess, he has to kind of take matters into his own hands and to do something sweeping, because these piecemeal efforts are really important. And together with the unions, we've done workshops on implementation on this PSLF waiver for more than 20,000 people since October. And we're trying to kind of keep the drumbeat, but more importantly, we're organizing for the next win. So I wanted to kind of stitch those ideas together.
Thank you, all of you. Mike, if I can, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question, because one of the things you mentioned earlier was how means testing could ultimately be exclusionary to people that the cancellation of student debt is purportedly meant to help, people who are making under a certain income threshold every year. And so if indeed that is what we see happen, it sounds like this implementation question of making sure that everything possible is getting done to remove those barriers to accessing the program, and while at the same time, to Mary's point, doing both and pushing for getting rid of those barriers on a policy level is going to be really important. Can you speak briefly as to, what kind of work is going to need to happen to make sure that those barriers, we do everything possible to dismantle those barriers?
Absolutely. So the good news, I think, is that on these kind of smaller programmatic debt cancellation programs that have existed under the law for a really long time, there is this incredible community of advocates for affected people that have been doing work to try to pull down administrative barriers and have been really successful over time. And part of that story just hasn't been told in a way that has broken through the way that I think the push to cancel student debt broadly has. But the Biden administration, under pressure from disability advocates and others, automated discharges for people that are total and permanently disabled. And more than 300,000 people have had their debts canceled by the Biden administration with no paperwork and no application process, just using government data. But the administration came in staring at this list of 500,000 people with significant disabilities that should have had their debts canceled under the law, and the program just wasn't working for them. And we're doing our best here to try, as advocates for kind of a automatic and immediate debt cancellation, to tee up those examples of how the administration has actually recognized administrative burden in this same context and done this really well and made a huge economic improvement to hundreds of thousands of people's lives, so that they seize the opportunity to do this for tens of millions of people. I don't know that we'll be successful. I mean, I think that we are realistic about the president's desire for this talking point, and I think it's deeply frustrating for a lot of folks that do work with low-income people, especially, that like the talking point is often more important than the outcome from the policy. And so I think that that's like a place where, as progressives, we should always be pushing. Like I think we worry a lot about how policy that's designed to be progressive will be regressive in implementation. And I think the student loan system is a great case study in that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in with one more thing on that?
Yeah, of course.
This is a bit more of a cynical layer to add on top, but I think it's a key part of what often happens is on top of the dynamics that Mike was just talking about, there's also a dynamic that sometimes shows up legislatively as well as in terms of administrative action, where politicians are trying to create a pressure release valve for political pressure that they're receiving, but the actual accessibility of the program or ability of the program to deliver the outcome that's intended is like a little bit less important to them. And so a program where they're like, we did the thing that you were demanding, never mind that it doesn't actually work for half of the people that it was intended to, or doesn't actually create the, the climate action impacts that we were looking for, can show up. And so I just add that to say, that is another reason why it's important to kind of track all the way through implementation, because if they get the carrot of the political pressure being relieved without delivering the outcome that the demand was tied to, then we haven't really completed our work.
That's such a good point. Thank you. I want to dig in a little more on a point that you made, Marion, that you alluded to as well, Juliana, which is about the durability of executive action compared to legislative action. We know that when President Biden came into office, he implemented 17 executive orders on his first day, many of which were aimed at rolling back some of the cruel and capricious administrative actions that the Trump administration took. So while we were glad to see that happen, of course, it's an indicator that executive actions can be undone with relative ease if and when the White House turns over. And so how do we build on administrative actions to make sure that they last, or so that we turn them into more durable legislative action? And Juliana, since you talked about this with respect to DACA, and since you've been fighting to preserve and build on DACA for a decade now, I want to start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Kat. I think like the first point I'm going to make is about one of these 17 executive orders, and like in the follow through that we have to think of, because one of them was this moratorium on deportations that Biden ran on and was supposed to implement. And of course, as soon as he signed that executive action, then it was challenged in the courts. And part of the follow through is not just implementation, because as soon as it was challenged, the administration gave up on it, right? Like they never appealed that decision. They just kind of forgot about it. But now they still claim that was one of the executive actions that they signed, even though nothing ever came of it, right? And so part of the pivot that Mary was mentioning before is also just making sure that it comes to fruition in any way, right? And I'll just, on DACA, I'll make a couple of points. Is just that, something that, because we won DACA and we won at the Supreme Court, it's taken the pressure off of Congress, right, to act. And I'll be honest, as an organizer, I think that there's some truth to that, but I will say that it also took some pressure off of us as organizers, off of people like me, who could now, work and provide for our families and focus on getting benefits and permanent protections, not just for ourselves, but for our entire community. So it kind of it creates a stepping stone for us to step on, take a deep breath, and continue fighting, right? Like as an organizer, that's one of the things that really drives me, is being able to offer any kind of benefit to the people mostly directly impacted by these oppressions, right? But what we've been doing at UWD and throughout the movement is really using DACA and the uncertainty that it has lived under since the Trump administration, right? Its vulnerability to build urgency and pressure for Congress to act, right? It's a lot harder for Congress to sit by while benefits are being taken away from people like me than it is for them to grant new ones, right? And so using DACA, and that's what our whole campaign this year is going to be about. The Home is Here Coalition is coming together, is to use these specific dates along with the Fifth Circuit hearing and decisions, and the upcoming Supreme Court battle to really show Congress that these are highly popular people with the American people, right? Like a vast majority of Americans agree on providing immigrant youth with a pathway to citizenship, and our families and our communities, right? And so for them to be sitting by while DACA is taken away, for Biden as Obama's vice president and now president to lose DACA during his first administration will just look really bad, right? Like, so using that to build pressure for permanent protections through Congress is really what we're envisioning this year. So I'll stop here so others can jump in too.
Juliana, that was great. One of the things I really liked about what you said was that it's really hard to take away benefits when they already exist versus implementing new ones. And I think sort of a key advocacy piece there is making sure that you're building the constituencies around the policies that you're creating, so that long after the ink is dry on the executive order or whatever it is, those constituencies are continuing to feel the benefits, and then they're going to defend and protect the policy no matter what. And the opposition is going to have an even harder time repealing it or taking it away. And so in the case of clean air, that's making sure that the public is aware of the public health benefits, less respiratory illnesses, less pollution related deaths, so that when that policy is in jeopardy, they're going to be willing to defend it no matter what.
Thank you, both of you. Mike, Mary, anything to add on that point? All right.
Well, yeah, sorry. I was thinking about this, Danny. I like 100% agree with you said, and what you said, and I think it's one of like the gnarly strategy pieces, because in a lot of times, if you organize a constituency to make sure that they understand that there is a benefit to be protected and that could be taken away, you have to say it's good and that they got something. And so I think part of what's hard is that so often we like get a partial win and then talk about how partial and incomplete it is and pivot to wanting more. And that's good and right and absolutely what we should do. But it's like at cross purposes with making people believe that they got something that is worth defending and at risk of being taken away. And so like, I don't think that there's like a magic answer to solve those cross purposes thing, but I think naming that explicitly and then trying to figure out the best way that we can as a movement to hold those tensions of like building a constituency behind a thing that we're calling good, while also demanding the rest of action that we need, whether that's on debt or climate or immigration justice or like whatever it is. It's like a core tension that sits at these strategy questions, not just for administrative action, but sort of for all of our campaigning.
Yeah, totally agree. And that's a great point, that it's hard to carry both of those things at once, particularly with messaging. And it's a little bit of our job as advocates to trust that folks can understand that nuanced message, that this is good, we got this win, but we also got to fight for more.
That's a great point. And I'm going to stay on that thread of strategy with my next question, because all of you have been involved in campaigns for executive actions across an array of issues, and I'm sure have seen strategies that have worked well and some that have worked not so well. And so what is one to do and one not to do that you want to share with the advocates and the organizers that are on this call today and who are trying to get their priorities over the finish line? Would love to hear one from each of you.
I have a not to do, which is also, I guess, sort of a to do, but unlike Congress that has, I think we could all spend some time introspecting about what it means to have a 6-3 reactionary Supreme Court, but Congress generally, what it legislates is legal. And I think as a rule for those of us that have done congressional advocacy, there isn't much that Congress is going to pass that seems like doomed to be struck down. The administrative state's much more complicated, and you have courts that are much more resistant to reading broadly into executive action, particularly when things become politicized. And so I think the what not to do is get the law wrong. And maybe the other way to frame that is the what to do is to make sure, if you are trying to propose that the law do something different than it's done in the past, to make sure that you have like built the legal infrastructure that sits around the demand, so that you are having both the inside conversation about how to use the state to better protect people, or lift people up at the same time as you're building a movement to advocate for change. Because the state doesn't like to change. Like, the federal government is a creature of inertia, and it doesn't want to do things differently than it's done them before, and is going to fight the politicals that want to change. It's going to fight the advocates that want change. It's going to fight the Hill that wants to put pressure on it to change, and it's going to do everything it can to stay the way that it's always been. I'm an inch wide in a mile deep. So like the education department is a good example of this, because it has been basically a predatory lender for a decade, and it likes being a predatory lender, and it doesn't think it's doing anything wrong. And the bureaucracy wants to keep pushing loans on people that can't repay them, and treating schools as its most important constituency, and ignoring the people that are the victims of this giant predatory lending scheme. And you can't shake it off of that worldview. So you have to make sure that if aligned politicals are going to tell it to do something different, they like have the kind of infrastructure around them to be successful in implementing it. And like we have proposed some things that I think are wacky and wild and outside of the mainstream as far as the bureaucracy is concerned. And it's taken a lot of work, a year and a half of the president asking the Justice Department and the Education Department to tell him whether it's legal or not to cancel student debt, to get to this place where we think it may possibly happen. But that's because there's been this effort by the lawyers, not just the organizers, to like move together and push the bureaucracy.
I love that. Thank you. And Juliana, Mary, Danny, any other suggestions or suggestions of things to avoid for folks?
Well, I have an example, but my very smart panelists kind of beat me to the punch in some other earlier questions here. But that, once an executive order or something has been made, you got to follow through no matter what, not just in the announcement, but throughout the implementation process. And I think a good example of this is the Justice 40 initiative. Folks might know about it already, but this was an announcement that the president made very early on, that 40% of all federal climate investments had to go to disadvantaged communities. And then they also made an announcement that they were going to create a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and an interagency council. And the work obviously doesn't stop with the creation of these councils and the executive order. And we need to build on the progress of that executive order. And part of that is listening to the guidance of the council members. And a lot of that is advancing the clean air and water regulations that will better protect those overburdened communities, making sure that the environmental justice screening tool is finalized, and making sure that agencies are actually following the J40 guidance and making sure that those communities are getting those investments. So while it was certainly a historic announcement, we got to make sure that the administration is doing the follow through throughout the implementation process.
I can go. Mine's actually a little connected to Mike's, although I super agree with the implementation stuff that we've been talking about the whole time. And my shorthand for it was going to be like, don't let the inside game and the outside game get disconnected. And the places where I've seen it work is where they stayed hooked. And the places where I've seen it really falter are where they got disconnected from each other. And I think that can look like a few different things. I mean, to go back to Mike's example, the law is malleable. And what is legal and what there is like legal support for changes over time based on who you're asking. And whether you're talking about DACA or debt relief, at different points, official government lawyers have said that that was not possible, was not within the legal authority of the government, right? And so being attentive to building that case, but not accepting the status quo as the confines of what's possible is really important. And so I think that I'll back up and say a different thing. I was saying before that one of my fallback frames is like when you're in a position of governing. It's not true when you're out of power. When you're in power, that one of my fallback frames is like sitting your butt on the left windowsill of the Overton window and locking in what you can. And there's a second piece of that, which is really important, which is that all of our job as movement is with one another, led by directly impacted people, to understand what our true constellation is headed towards our North Star. There are false stars in the sky. There are reformist reforms that will not move you towards your North Star, that are just pressure release valves for politicians. And the work that so many of us have to do together is discern what is a real star in our constellation that moves us towards our North Star, and what's a false star that distracts us and releases political pressure. It is so hard for the folks on the inside to differentiate false stars from real stars without being connected to movement on the outside. And this was true before I was at Indivisible. I was at Detention Watch Network, working at the intersection of the immigration system and the criminal legal system, specifically on immigrant detention. And under the Obama administration, there were a bunch of detention reforms that were available that were inside the Overton window, but that were mostly pressure release valves that didn't actually change the analysis or the sort of change the weather on immigration detention. And so I think whether you're talking about student debt or climate or immigration detention or anything else, the inside-outside connection, both for like tactical coordination, but also for this big picture, like discerning fault stars and real stars thing, I think is a critical part of success.
And I can go really quickly because that was all brilliant and I don't have much more to add, but I think that as UWD, one of the things that we have learned really is to be as inclusive and as broad as possible in our ask, in our organizing, talking about the outside strategy, right? Because unfortunately, like what we've been learning with DACA is that because it is so restrictive, because it has so many date cutoffs and age limits and criminal bars, that it ends up like leaving a lot of folks out. And now, especially as folks get older, like myself, or new folks come in and aren't able to participate in the program, it really shows how short-lived these executive actions can be, right? So yeah, just making sure that you include as many people as possible in the output, in the result of what you're asking for.
Thank you, all of you. Those were really insightful suggestions. And I'm going to ask a follow-up question, because one thing that a number of you touched on was this idea that, what is legal, what is within the federal government's authority. You're going to get different answers to that question depending on who you ask. And to me, that indicates how important personnel is, which maybe isn't the first thing that comes to mind when we think about strategies and implementing executive actions or even frankly legislation, because it's going to be the folks at those agencies who are deciding how to implement the laws that Congress passes. And so, do any of you have examples of how you've prioritized personnel as a part of your policy strategies, or what you want folks at home to know who are maybe thinking like, well, why does it matter to me who ends up in this position? I trust whoever the president's going to put in place because I trust the president. Why do we need to be thinking about who these people are and why it matters for our policy priorities?
I mean, I'll jump in here real quick, just because I would say that like the folks that President Biden has put in place at DHS weren't folks that we had any, opposition to. I'll be honest, we didn't include that as part of the strategy. But the truth of the matter is that even when we have people who are supposedly friendly to advocates and to the movement, right? Implement the way that implementation works can still like bring everything to a halt. The main example that comes to mind is that when President Biden came in and put Secretary Mayorkas in place and folks at USCIS, there was a huge backlog, right? And it was in a very specific time frame where we had just one from the Supreme Court, but Judge Hainan was about to put an injunction on the program. So for 6 months, we were allowed to get initial applications into USCIS, but because of the folks who were in there couldn't get it together, about 80,000 people ended up in this limbo where they sent in their initial applications, but they were never processed. And now there is a case trying to get the government to be able to give them some kind of temporary relief. That's not DACA, but at the same time, like it was because of bad implementation, bad running of USCIS that happened, right? So just wanted to give folks that example in case folks don't know there are about 80,000 people in some kind of limbo because we we couldn't move those fast enough when this new administration came in.
That's a great example. Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of more questions for the group before we turn to audience Q&A. One of the things that got touched on briefly earlier is the Build Back Better agenda, which we know unfortunately has not made it to the president's desk in legislative form. And so I'm wondering if all of you have parts of the Build Back Better agenda that you are hoping to see implemented via executive actions, and how you weigh kind of the trade-off that we've been discussing, wherein you do want to see something achieved, but you also don't want to give up the push for more durable, perhaps more comprehensive legislative action. Danny, or Mike, if you have an answer, go ahead. Danny, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the climate element of this too, since that's such a big part of Build Back Better.
And I was actually just going to take myself out of this conversation. I think that we as a movement took a very executive action first strategy when the coalition building was happening around BBB, and part of the reason why I think some of us feel like we're the last folks standing here is because we stepped outside of Congress and have just been focusing on the executive since Inauguration Day. So I can shut my mouth, but.
Yeah, I can start. I do want to say that, yes, a reconciliation deal has not materialized. It is not on the president's desk. It is going slow, to say the least. But there are positive conversations that have been going on with Senator Manchin and Leader Schumer recently, and we're hopeful that a deal has come together. And I just want to say that because I think anything that folks can do to keep up that pressure is enormously helpful, but also recognizing that we got to do both at the same time. We need both if we want to reach our climate commitments. And to that end, Evergreen put out a paper that is sort of promptly named the 6 ways that President Biden can use executive action to act on climate. And I can drop that in the chat, but that covers a wide range of topics like clean electricity, transportation, the built environment, manufacturing, fossil fuel giveaways, and agriculture and oceans and lands and that kind of thing. And that also, we also launched our 100% Clean Power campaign that I talked about before, that has those 3 pillars to make sure that the administration is moving to deliver on their 100% clean electricity commitments. And I'll drop that in the chat as well.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I know we have got about 25 minutes left, and so I want to make sure that we get to some audience questions that we've been receiving. Juliana, the first one is for you. Immigration is one of the areas where, as we know, presidents have some of the broadest executive powers, and folks want to know, what would you love to see right now from the president? What's on your top priorities for immigration executive actions?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that the main priority for us with the president right now is, one, yes, defend DACA, right, expand it. And we are looking at the administration putting out this new final rule to try and strengthen the program throughout the court challenges that it's enduring. And we hope that the final rule is very different from what they proposed at first, and that it actually they go bold and expand the program, bring it up to date with all these cutoff dates and age limits, as I've been mentioning. The other priority for us is our anti-enforcement work, right? And this is really where the administration has a lot of leeway because of their prosecutorial discretion, because of their enforcement privileges, right? And so we know that they've been trying to get rid of Title 42. We really need this administration to go really a lot bolder when it comes to defending their decisions to lift these draconian, terrible, terrorizing really actions that the last administration took, right? So Title 42 and PP are really our priorities. Closing down detention centers, right? They have the power to do that. Asking for less detention beds to be funded through their budget requests, right? These are all things that this administration can do to stop the terrorizing of our undocumented communities in this country and our immigrant folks. On the relief side, we've seen them grant TPS, right, and parole to a lot of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers. We want to see more of that, right? We know that DACA is a policy. They could create a parole program that's not just targeted at immigrant youth, that can really include all of our families and all of our communities. We know that, you know, something like DACA was also on the table at some point and was challenged in the courts. So really, we want to see them take a bolder step, right? We saw in the last administration, whatever they wanted to do, they threw everything at the wall and saw what stuck. And I'm not saying that that was the right way to do, but sometimes we get really disappointed in how this administration is handling their promises, right? And how quick they are to just kind of give up on things, just like the moratorium on deportations that I mentioned earlier. So.
Thank you so much. Danny, the next audience question is for you, and it's about the Supreme Court case called West Virginia versus EPA. And in case folks on the call don't know, this really revolves around the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. So it kind of gets at that question of things that federal agencies can do that we've been talking about. Can you share anything, Danny, about what we ought to expect from that case? And what's the best way for folks on this call to stay up to date and take action once a decision comes out?
Yeah, no, thank you to whomever brought that up. This is a really important case. So for those of you who don't know, West Virginia v. EPA is a case that the court heard a few months ago, and the decision is going to come out any moment now. And it's about how much authority the EPA has to address the climate crisis by regulating carbon dioxide emissions from power plants under the Clean Air Act. And it was brought up by a block of red states and members of the coal industry, and they're challenging what you may remember as the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, which was a plan to tackle carbon dioxide emissions in the power sector. The plan never went into effect, and the Biden administration said that they were going to issue their own plan, but nevertheless, the Supreme Court took up the case, and this is extremely unprecedented. And they're effectively arguing that the Clean Power Plan would have imposed such strict limitations on the energy sector that they basically would have to do what they call generation shift, which means moving from dirtier sources of clean energy like coal to more to cleaner sources that have less emissions like solar and wind. And they claim that this is out of the Clean Air Act's authority. We have conservative court who's already indicated that they have an interest in sharply limiting the power of the EPA and their ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We hope that they uphold the Clean Power Plan, but they may severely restrict the scope of the EPA's authority if restricted entirely. And then there's a lot of ways to plug in here. Evergreen's going to be doing a lot of rapid response explainer content like blogs and videos, and possibly a Twitter Spaces that's going to explain the decision and its impact. And we also have an action alert sign up that you can sign up for that's going to have a lot of updates, including maybe a day of event on the Supreme Court steps. So hope to see you there.
Awesome. Thank you, Danny. The next question we got has to do with executive actions that can be done to protect reproductive rights. And while we don't have anybody from the reproductive rights or justice or health community on this call, I do want to not let that question go because I know it's so top of mind for people at this moment. People are wondering, are there executive actions that the Biden administration can take to protect abortion and reproductive health even after the Dobbs decision comes down? down if indeed it looks anything like the opinion that was leaked last month. And I don't want to ask any of you to comment on that unless you would like to, but I do want to ask my colleague Heejin to drop a link in the chat. I know there is a story today in NBC News about a group of senators that is pushing for exactly this, for executive actions to make sure that abortion care and reproductive health care is protected if and when a Dobbs decision comes down. So would encourage folks to take a look at that and know that this is something that folks in Congress are thinking about, and that I'm sure folks in the repro community are thinking about right now. Just didn't want to let that question go unanswered. Looks like the last question we have from our audience has to do with litigation and the fact that there was decent success in challenging or at least delaying certain Trump executive actions via litigation, but the fact that now that strategy is being used to stymie some of the Biden administration's priorities. And the person asking this question points out that the makeup of the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court make it really difficult to achieve the kinds of executive actions that we have been talking about today that we would like to see happen. Both because those actions or regulations can be struck down, but as this person points out, bad precedents can be set that prevent good executive actions from being taken in the future. And so do any of you want to speak to some of the costs or benefits of litigation now that we're sort of seeing the ways it can stymie administrative action?
I can jump in first. Unless somebody else, any takers, other panelists, no one says. I have a couple of thoughts on this. The first is I don't think we can sugarcoat what a perilous time for the functioning of our democracy we are in right now. And like that's just the backdrop for this conversation, is the extremism of the Supreme Court. And the way that they are oriented towards the functioning of the government. I mean, the case that Danny is talking about is whether or not the Environmental Protection Agency can protect the environment. Like that is essentially like what that comes down to. And so the extremism of the Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit is a huge part of the story of what's going on here. From a strategic point of view, I would say we actually don't have the option of opting against litigation as weaponized against policy. That decision has already been made by a multi-decade conservative takeover of the courts. So that landscape is already in front of us. The only choice we really have is whether or not we also use that tool to try to mitigate harm or not. If we were in a point of American history where that was not an already weaponized tool, then I think I would land in a different place about a risk assessment. But at this point in time, for me, this is like similar, to be honest, to like campaign finance policy, which is, I think I certainly agree with the progressive position that we need to get money out of politics. But as long as money is in politics, progressives have to contest, and why can't talk about it on C3 call. Anyway, I think that when you look at the landscape, sorry, Jess, when you think about the landscape in front of you, you have to fight on a level playing field. I mean, this reminds me of some of the conversations that we had earlier around the filibuster, right? And concerns that if the filibuster was removed, wouldn't that be used to jam through legislation? We had to look at the asymmetric terrain that we were already on and recognize that that choice point wasn't in front of us, it was actually in the rearview mirror, and that we had to be smart and strategic about using the tools before us. The other thing that I'll say is that the court's relationship with precedent has changed. And the fact that we're all waiting for a Dobbs decision that we're pretty sure we know how it's going to come down is evidence of the fact that the court's relationship to precedent has changed. And so I'm not saying it's good that it is precedent is much less binding than it has been in the past, but I also do think that that's part of the mix of how we think about the risks of litigation in this particular era of American history.
And I agree with all of that. I think that's a very savvy insight in terms of the evolving law and what that means for organizing. But I would also just add that we should want Joe Biden to get caught stealing a little bit on some of this stuff. Like in a world where people understand that the court is reactionary and political, the easier it is to bring in kind of bigger structural democratic reforms too. And picking the right fights and making Americans understand that things are being taken away from them by a reactionary court that's unaccountable to the political process is not bad. I think we get, again, we spend all day talking about student debt over here, but like we get asked this question often, particularly of late, about whether this executive action that may or may not be on the table is legal. And I think as a movement, our answer has been, to some degree, the law is whatever 6 Supreme Court justices make it to be. And it's better for Joe Biden to be seen fighting hard for the people to put him in office than for him to be seen running away from the fight. And that is not a legal answer. It's a political one, but that's okay.
I think we're going to wrap up on that note. Mary, Juliana, Mike, Danny, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, for all of the tremendous work that you are doing to make these priorities a reality. I am absolutely in awe of your expertise and the passion that you bring to the work that you do. So thank you for being with us today. And thanks to everybody who's joined us. I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Jess, to share a few closing thoughts, and hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I just want to echo what Kat's thanks to all of our panelists. We really appreciate you coming and wrestling with these tough questions. I think that one of the best things that we can do is not pretend these aren't hard questions and not pretend that we don't have to balance these equities and think about the strategy. So thank you for joining us for that conversation. I want to remind folks that we have deviated from our regular scheduled programming. We're about to do it again, but this came up a lot in this conversation. So I want to encourage everyone to make sure you sign up for our next conversation on July 7th, which is in 4 weeks, back on a Thursday though, which will be about the Supreme Court. We are going to be breaking down what happened in this recent Supreme Court session and looking at what the legislative implications of all of those decisions will be. I think it's going to be a really important conversation. I really encourage you to join us for it. I know I'm looking forward to it. I want someone to explain all of the implications of what's coming down the pike for us. So really encourage you to sign up for that conversation. It will be July 7th. So it's a week later than normal. And also make sure you've signed up so that you can get the great resources. We have been collecting all the resources that all of our panelists shared in the chat, and we will share them in a folder for you along with a video of this session in case you want to watch it again or send it to a friend. So please make sure you have signed up, and really thank everyone for sharing your time and your talent with us and for joining us for this conversation. We really appreciate you, and we're so grateful to be in this movement with all of you. Thanks, everyone.